Cool. So my name is Evan,
I'm Malcolm.
And Thad.
and we did a project on Sumatran orangutans. So we've all seen how R can be used to model endangered species through the lambda, the reproductive values, to understand if they are viable long term or if they're going to go extinct and how we can prevent their extinction. The best example is through the loggerhead sea turtles, and our project is in a very similar vein to that.
So our main question research-wise is, what is the state of the Sumatran orangutan population in the Catambe Preserve? We decided to study this population because Sumatran orangutans have been critically endangered for about 20 years, and there's very few remaining fragments of habitat for these orangutans especially because of the palm oil plantations that are kind of all over Sumatra. The three more specific research questions we had were, is this population of orangutans stable? What stages and ages are most important? And could this population be a source for other reserves and support other populations?
So a quick overview of the study site of Catambe. It's here at the northern tip of the Sumatran island. The study is a 32-year-long study where they followed certain orangutans in order to create a life history table. And this site has relatively high infant survivorship compared to the sister study site that's around this area, and that's potentially because of less deforestation and the protected status of the park. And so yeah, heavy deforestation surrounding it may increase the population density within, because they're all flocking to this one area that's protected. Quick overview of orangutan life history. They have the longest interbirth interval of any ape, as well as they're the most solitary of any ape, creating less dense populations than other ape species. Females first reproduce around 15 years old, and there's relatively low infant mortality across the species, and males go from infant, juvenile, unflanged to flanged stage. So right here is a photo of an unflanged male without any big cheek pouches.
Cool. So this is the bubble and arrow diagram that we made. The equations here aren't really relevant to the analyses that we were doing, just based off of the data that we were given. But it's still really helpful to sort of just conceptualize the study species as a whole. We separated it into three different groups based off of similarities in the survivorship and fecundity values that we're going to show you in a couple of slides. Ages 0 to 14 being infant and adolescent, age 15 being first-year breeders, age 16 being reproductive females, and then, you know, each of them having their mortality and fecundities relating them to each other. Then sort of talking about the data that we are using, we used it from this one paper by Witch et al., where they analyzed these species over 32 years. They were able to get a life stage classes, like a table estimating that. They also had another table that had realistic age estimates for the species as well. And then we found on an online matrix database, the authors of this paper included a Leslie matrix that had all the survivorship and fecundity values across all the observed years.
So next we're going to get into what we actually did as our analysis. So we had this Leslie matrix from the authors of that paper. This Leslie matrix is based on years, not stages. So there were 53 columns and 53 rows for all of the years of reproductive orangutans. Across the diagonal, we see the survival. Most of the survivals from the study were 1, just because of the scope of the survival. For example, there were no observed deaths of 3-year-old orangutans, so the 1 in the 3 column just represents 100% survival there. There's also fecundity across the top row. We can see that the fecundity of 15-year-old orangutans is a lot lower than the fecundity of the rest of the adults, but the fecundity stays very constant for all adult years from 16 to like 52.
Cool. So after this, using the Leslie matrix, we created an elasticity matrix just by transposing that data and creating a reproductive value against the stable age distribution. And the main takeaways from this matrix were that infant survivability from years 0 to 14 were the most important for population growth. And as Thad just mentioned, the infant survivability is kind of already maxed out. So it's more saying that infant survival, high infant survival is something that we need to protect in terms of life history stages. And another trend we saw was as adult females age, their potential contribution decreases, meaning their elasticity decreases in terms of how it contributes to population growth. And here is just kind of evidence of that trend in those two trends that I just mentioned.
Cool. Yeah, so this is the code that we use to create the reproductive values. We should all be relatively familiar with it. It's just transposing the matrix, that the Leslie matrix, and then getting the eigenvalues from that, or the vectors, and then dividing that to create a plot eventually that is in the next slide. And this is that plot of all the reproductive values across the entire life of an orangutan that we would observe, which is 53 years, scaled to the first year. So the first year would be 1. And we can sort of just see that the reproductive value peaks right before it's able to reproduce. And then after that, it sort of just declines from year to year, which is similar to what we saw with the elephants and other species.
We took what we learned from those elasticity values and the reproductive values and decided to investigate a couple different scenarios and their effect on lambda. So our original code is kind of up top, just pulling lambda from the eigenvalues from the Leslie matrix. Then you can see in our modified parameters, lines 251 and 252, we just changed the survivorship for 2 different years within that infant stage to test out a new lambda. And the results of that are here. We have our original lambda was 0.98998, indicating that the population is in a slight decline and will not kind of avoid extinction in this preserve as it is right now. When we increased infant survivorship to 1, we got a lambda of greater than 1. We also were able to get a lambda greater than 1 by increasing fecundity by a couple different ways, by 100%, by 50%, and even just by 36%, we're able to get slight population growth. We decided to increase lambda by a percentage instead of just increasing 1 year's lambda or a couple years lambda, because lambda is constant throughout the orangutan life cycle, so increasing them all makes the most sense. We also discovered that you could get slight population growth by increasing survivorship of infants to 0.91 and fecundity by about 10%, which we think is a little more realistic than, for example, increasing survivorship to 1 across the board.
Assumptions that we made in terms of our matrix is it's unclear how the Catambe population compares to ancestral and historical populations of Sumatran orangutans. So data that we found here and kind of assumptions and takeaways that we found here may not apply to previous populations. And the matrix that we have assumes external pressures such as deforestation, poaching and resource availability remains constant over time, which is not necessarily true. And then we didn't factor males into our model, and this may change the values because males have a polymorphic, males are polymorphic, and you can see the 2 polymorphs here, one cheeked and one uncheeked. And then larger populations in maybe historical past may display density-dependent factors such as disease, cultural transmission, collective foraging, and collective care that we may not see in less dense populations nowadays in places like Catambe.
Cool. So just to sort of summarize what this means for the conservation of the species at this site, the original values that we found for this population at the Catambe area is sort of unfortunate because we found that the lambda value was less than 1. So that means that it is not viable long term and is headed towards extinction. But we have found different pathways for us to increase that lambda over 1. And that mainly just means increasing fecundity and keeping infant mortality as low as possible. That could be either due through increasing the resource base or just through like direct efforts to prevent infant mortality?
We also were hoping that maybe future research would study the unknown effects of population density on these kind of matrices and whether population density is being affected by the shrinking of this kind of available habitat. And also we would like to compare this matrix to matrices from more stable populations just to see what's different and how we could improve this matrix to help the population survive.
Thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you.